Welcome to Marine Gurukul video series. In this video, we shall learn about limits and boundaries of maritime zones, rights and obligations of countries in different maritime zones, and the meaning of the term right to innocent passage. As ships operator, it's important for us to know this so that we are aware of our rights, duties, and obligations when our vessels operate in different maritime zones. United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea 1982, popularly known as UNCLOS, stipulates a framework for the country's jurisdiction in the maritime spaces or the maritime areas. UNCLOS provides a backbone for offshore governance, that is, governance of the seas by the coastal states and other stakeholders, including those navigating the oceans, by dividing these maritime areas into primarily five main zones, namely internal waters, territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone or EEZ, and the high seas. UNCLOS not only divides the sea areas into different zones, but it also provides specific guidance for states' rights and obligations and responsibilities in different zones, thus providing each of the maritime zone a different legal status. The limits or the breadths or the extent of various maritime zones is measured from a reference line called as the baseline. Baseline is the low water line along the coast as officially recognized and announced by the coastal state. So though baseline is supposedly the low water line along the coast, but it has to have the official recognition and announcement of the coastal state. It is this baseline that forms the reference from which the breadth of all the maritime zones, including the territorial sea, are measured. This baseline divides the waters, one to the seaward side, other to the landward side. All waters to the landward of the baseline, like rivers, ponds, lakes, etc., which fall to the landward of the baseline, they are all referred to as internal waters. The coastal state has full sovereignty or full complete sovereign rights over its internal waters. Sovereign rights mean complete, absolute, uncontrollable rights enjoyed by a free state as they would enjoy over the land. There is no right of innocent passage through the internal waters of a coastal state. The first maritime zone to the seaward of the baseline is the Territorial Sea. The Territorial Sea limits extend maximum up to 12 nautical miles. That means the coastal state can decide on the extent of its territorial sea, but this extent cannot be more than 12 nautical miles seaward of the baseline. Most of the coastal states have declared their territorial sea limits at 12 nautical miles, but because of varied reasons like the geographical location, etc., there are coastal states whose territorial sea limits are less than 12 nautical miles. Over the territorial sea, the coastal states have complete sovereign rights and jurisdiction. And this sovereignty is not limited only to the surface of the sea. It is enjoyed over the seabed as well as subsoil and the vertical space above the territorial sea. So now the question arises, if a coastal state enjoys sovereign rights over the territorial sea, how does it differ from internal waters? The difference is that over the territorial sea, other states also have rights as listed under freedom of navigation in the UNCLOS. What does it mean? Coastal states' rights over the territorial seas are limited by the right of innocent passage, which is enjoyed by other states through their territorial sea, and also right of transit passage through international straits if they happen to fall within the territorial sea of a coastal state. Now the boundary of the territorial sea, whether it is 12 miles or less than 12 miles, divides the airspace into two distinct components. From the limits of the territorial sea to the landward is the national airspace. Unlike the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea, the aircrafts do not, I repeat, do not enjoy right of innocent passage through the national airspace of a country. So national airspace is exclusive and the coastal state has complete jurisdiction over the national airspace. The airspace to the seaward of this territorial limit is what we call as international airspace, which is open to aircrafts of all the countries. A coastal state may establish, not necessary, may establish a zone called as the contiguous zone, starting from the limits of the territorial sea, extending up to a distance of not more than 24 nautical miles from the baseline. So the outer limit of the contiguous zone would also be again measured from the baseline itself. Now this contiguous zone is an intermediary zone which a coastal state may establish between its territorial sea and the high seas. This zone is, if established, is to enhance a coastal state's law enforcement capacity and prevent violators or the criminals from fleeing the territorial sea after committing a crime within the territory of the coastal state. The coastal state has the right to both prevent and punish infringement of fiscal, that is monetary, financial, immigration, sanitary, and custom laws within its territory as well as the territorial sea. Unlike the territorial sea, the contiguous zone only gives jurisdiction to a state on the ocean surface and the floor. It does not provide the rights in the space. Why? Because the airspace above the contiguous zone forms a part of the international airspace. A coastal state may establish an exclusive economic zone starting from the limits of the territorial sea and extending to a limit not exceeding 200 nautical miles from the baseline. It means the EEZ has its inner limit same as the limit of the territorial sea, and its outer limit is as set by the coastal state, not exceeding 200 nautical miles from the baseline. Now, it may raise a question as to why the inner limit of the EEZ is from the limits of the territorial sea and not the outer limit of the contiguous zone. If you remember, we said contiguous zone may be established. It's optional. So a coastal state may establish a contiguous zone, may not establish a contiguous zone, and may have a EEZ. So the EEZ has its limits, starting from the limit of the territorial sea to an outer limit not exceeding 200 nautical miles from the baseline. Within the EEZ, a coastal state has sovereign rights, absolute rights, for the purpose of exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing the natural resources. So these sovereign rights are only limited for certain purposes. And these natural resources could be living as well as non-living, could be at the seabed or subsoil. So the sovereign rights of the coastal state are only limited at exploiting, exploring, conserving these natural resources. The coastal state also has a right to carry out activities like production of energy from water, currents, wind, etc. Unlike the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, the EEZ only allows for these activities related to natural resources. It does not give a coastal state the right to prohibit or limit freedom of navigation or freedom of overflight. Of course, this freedom is also subject to limited exceptions, but otherwise the coastal state has no right to limit freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. To the seaward of EEZ, that means beyond the outer boundaries of the EEZ, the seas and oceans are referred to as high seas. The high seas are considered as a common heritage of all mankind and is beyond any national jurisdiction. They do not belong to any country. The states or the countries can conduct activities in these areas as long as they are for peaceful purposes. For example, transiting through high seas, activities related to marine science and undersea exploration. So all such peaceful activities can be conducted at high seas by any country. Other than that, high seas belong to every one of us and is a common heritage of all mankind. There is one more term which we must learn. That is the continental shelf. Continental shelf has its inner boundary limits starting from the limits of the territorial sea, and its outer limit depends on the location of the continental margin. If the continental margin is at a distance of less than 200 miles from the baseline, then the continental shelf is deemed to extend from territorial sea to 200 nautical miles from the baseline. However, if the continental margin is lies beyond 200 nautical miles from the baseline, then the continental shelf shall be deemed to extend from territorial sea to the continental margin, which happens to lie beyond 200 nautical miles. Now, what is the significance of this continental shelf? Until now, we had learned that the coastal state is entitled to economic activities only up to the limits of its exclusive economic zone. Now, if the continental shelf outer limit falls outside the limits of the EEZ, then the coastal state's right of economic activities get extended beyond the EEZ up to the limit of the continental shelf. During our discussion about the limits, rights, and obligations of the coastal state within various maritime zones, we came across a term, right of innocent passage. Let's try and understand the meaning of this phrase, right of innocent passage. UNCLOS Article 17, titled Right of Innocent Passage, allows ships of all states, all countries, whether coastal or landlocked, enjoy the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea of the coastal states. As per Article 18 of the UNCLOS, the word passage means navigation through the territorial sea for the purpose of traversing that sea, that means passing that sea, without entering the internal waters or calling at a roadstead, anchorage, or port facility outside the internal waters. That means a through and through passage, or proceeding to or from internal waters, or a call at such roadstead or port facility. That means the ship may have on its schedule to call a port or a roadstead or a port facility inside the internal waters or inside the territorial limits. So that will also be treated as a passage. Passage shall be continuous and expeditious. No unnecessary disruptions, no unwarranted delays. However, passage includes stopping and anchoring, but only as far as same is incidental to ordinary navigation or are rendered necessary by force majeure, that is circumstantial, or distress, or for the purpose of rendering assistance to persons, ships, or aircrafts in danger or distress on the passage. Having learnt the meaning of the word passage under Article 18 of the UNCLOS, we now understand the meaning of word innocent passage, which is contained or defined in Article 19 of the UNCLOS. Passage is innocent so long as it is not prejudicial to the peace, good order, or security of a coastal state. Such passage shall take place in conformity with UNCLOS and the other rules of international law. So a passage, as long as it is not threatening the peace, security, good order of the coastal state, is in accordance with the international law and other requirements of UNCLOS, the passage shall be deemed to be innocent passage. The same article goes on to elaborate on the term prejudicial. Passage of a foreign ship shall be considered to be prejudicial to the peace, good order, or security of a coastal state if in the territorial sea it engages in any of the following activities: any threat or use of force against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of the coastal state, or in any other manner in violation of the principles of international law embodied in the Charter of United Nations. Any exercise or practice with weapons of any kind. Any act aimed at collecting information to the prejudice of the defense or security of the coastal state, something like spying. Any act of propaganda aimed at affecting the defense or security of the coastal state. The launching, landing, or taking on board of any aircraft. The launching, landing, or taking on board of any military device. The loading or unloading of any commodity, currency, or persons contrary to customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary laws and regulations of the coastal state. Any act of willful and serious pollution contrary to the convention. Any fishing activities, carrying out of research or survey activities Any act aimed at interfering with any system of communication or any other facilities or installations of the coastal state. If any of these things are done, and any other activity which is not having a direct bearing on the passage, if the vessel indulges in any activity not having a direct bearing on the passage, that shall also be deemed to be prejudicial to the peace and safety security of the coastal state. So what we have learned here now is, A, what is the meaning of innocent passage? Innocent passage means a passage which is not endangering the peace, security, good order, independence of the coastal state. Which are the acts which could be considered as prejudicial or acts against the interest of the coastal state, which could violate the meaning of word innocent passage? And they include use of threat against use of force against the sovereignty, political independence, territory, use of arms, lending of aircrafts, lending or taking of any currency in or people in violation of military activities. All these will basically be activities which will be prejudicial to the peace and good order of the coastal state. So if a foreign ship wishes to enjoy the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea of a coastal state, then it must ensure that it meets the meaning of word passage as per Article 18 of the UNCLOS, and it meets the requirement of innocent passage as enumerated in Article 19 of the UNCLOS. We hope you find this video useful. Thank you very much for watching Marine Gurukul video series. We look forward to your continued support, and your motivation means a lot to us, and it keeps us charged up for sharing more and more useful content with all our viewers and subscribers. Thank you very much for watching Marine Gurukul video series.